This video will help explain where to catch fish and what bait to use.
Welcome to Learn to Fish with us, and I'm Great Karch. Today we're going to talk about the different fish species, where do we find them, and what bait do we use to catch them. This morning I was actually out fishing for the bluegill here. Bluegills typically can be found in winter in bays, and sometimes they can be found out in open water. Bluegills do roam all over. During spring, you'll definitely find the bluegills in the shallows because they will be spawning. And in summer, most of the time you can find these out roaming. They'll either be in the shallows or they'll be out roaming in water, roaming the main parts of the lake. Typically baits. When I'm ice fishing for these, I'll use spikes and waxworms and plastic. And when I'm fishing for these during the summer months, same thing. Spikes, waxworms, worms, redworms. Rock bass, well, I typically don't fish for these a lot. But when I do fish for rock bass, or when I do catch them, I'm using worms. Worms, waxworms, and usually I find rock bass either in shallow rocks or in deeper rocks, but rock bass will be hanging around rocks. Crappies typically in spring and winter, we'll find the crappies in the bays and also out in the open water or in the deeper water, and they'll just be swimming along. Crappies, like waxworms, spikes, during winter, along with minnows, and that's probably the bait of choice during summer. During spring, I think the bait of choice would be small minnows. One thing to remember with a crappie is, if you start catching crappies have a very large but tender mouth. So when we're setting the hook on crappies, make sure not to set it quite as hard. Perch, yummy. Typically today I was fishing for perch and caught a few 9-10 inchers. I was using spikes and waxworms, and we were fishing in bays and fishing in the open water. Typically, I've also used minnows or minnow heads during the winter months. These fish usually on Lake Winnebago, which is where I live. Perch can either be found on the tops of the reefs during the summer months or right off the edge. White bass. White bass tend to migrate up the river out here in the Lake Winnebago system. During the spring, during the winter and summer months, they'll be found in open water, usually in the deeper water. And in spring, what they'll do is they'll actually swim up the river. We typically use Wolf River rigs in the river, along with minnows. And I've also caught white bass on crankbaits. Basically, crankbaits, they're anywhere from this size to number 7. Catfish, bullhead. Typically these can be found really anywhere, but most of the time I find it in a little bit deeper water. And typically I use night crawlers for catfish and bullhead. I've caught a few catfish trolling crankbaits, and then they are also stink bait. Stink bait is what they use to really get the big catfish. And when we find most of the bigger catfish on Lake Winnebago system, we'll find them in the Wolf and Fox River. Carp. The biggest thing when fishing carp, I've caught carp in bays, I've caught carp in creeks, rivers. The biggest thing I use is worms, night crawlers, and I also used a dough bait, which is cornmeal with molasses. The biggest thing when fishing for carp is make sure your bait is on the bottom because they're sucking the bottom. Bass. I don't really fish bass a lot, but some of the baits, for bass, in the spring they come in to spawn, so you'll find bass in the shallows. A couple weeks ago I had I'm guessing a 6-pound largemouth on through the ice. Fortunately, I had a 5-inch hole, and the bass I think was more like 8 inches, so I never was able to catch it. But you'll see bass swimming around the shallows in spring and winter. They like the weeds. They like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. And in spring and winter, they like the weeds. The best bait for bass would be plastic worms, crankbaits. I've caught them on night crawlers. Smallmouth bass. Most of the time, smallmouth bass really relate to deeper weed lines, deeper rocks. Preferred baits for smallmouth would be crankbaits, leeches. I mean, you know, some of the biggest smallmouth that I've got have come from leeches. Night crawlers, sometimes you'll catch them on minnows. Sauger, really what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about sauger and walleyes together because basically you fish them the same way. The Lake Winnebago system, most of those fish, they'll actually migrate up the rivers in spring and they'll go spawn in the marshes. So I'll fish for them, you know, with a jig and minnow in spring. I'll troll crankbaits in both the shallows, the deep water. Walleyes and saugers can be found really anywhere in the lake. I'll also use night crawlers on a crawler harness. So really, walleyes and saugers can be caught with almost any bait that you have in your tackle box. Northerns. Northerns typically are found in winter and in spring in the bays because they also spawn in bays. Typically we'll use golden shiners, so we'll use minnows that are this big to catch these fish. Sometimes the bigger the bait, the bigger the fish. We'll also cast spoons out as they really are attracted to minnows and a spoon looks like a minnow. And then not only that, we'll cast crankbaits. We'll cast baits into the water for both northern and muskie that are this big, sometimes even this big. The good old muskie. Muskies, same thing. They can be found really anywhere. River systems, out in the middle of the lake, up in Green Bay, they're all over the place. A muskie, most of the time we'll use really large suckers to actually catch these in the fall. Besides casting really big bucktails, other big lures, when you look at it, you're like, wow, do we really use baits this big? But yes, we do. So those are little bit details of where you'll find the fish and what type of baits you use to catch the fish.
This video has been brought to you by Learn to Fish with Us.